When a narcissist decides to betray someone they have identified as a super empath, they expect the whole cycle to unfold exactly the way it always has before. Trick them, discard them, regain control, then repeat the process all over again. What they never stop to consider, what never even crosses their mind, is that a super empath is not weak, not naive, and not dependent on them in the way they assume. This is someone who has already survived chaos before and come out the other side with a far deeper understanding of human nature than the narcissist has ever managed to develop. So when you betray someone like that, you are not simply breaking trust in the ordinary sense. You are setting off a transformation you cannot take back. It becomes the exact moment when the person who has been quietly carrying the emotional weight of the relationship finally sets that weight down, stands up straight, and looks at the narcissist with total, unclouded clarity. That clarity is precisely what causes the narcissist's world to collapse, because nothing terrifies them more than someone who stops playing along, someone who refuses to be controlled any longer, someone who understands the mask they wear better than they understand it themselves. The narcissist's betrayal is the very thing that wakes the super empath up and shatters the illusion they had been living inside. For so long, the super empath operates from a place of sincerity, loyalty, and a kind of emotional intelligence that gets constantly mistaken for weakness by people who cannot recognize it for what it actually is. They extend compassion not because they lack any inner strength, but because they genuinely understand pain and human nature on a deep, intuitive level. That understanding is exactly what makes them patient, forgiving, and willing to look past surface appearances toward whatever might be underneath. The narcissist misreads all of that patience as blindness, misreads that compassion as dependency, misreads that emotional depth as something they can simply take advantage of without ever facing consequences. They assume the empath experiences the world through the same reactive, fragile lens they themselves operate from, never once realizing that the empath's real strength comes from self-awareness and a clear internal sense of right and wrong. When the betrayal finally happens, when the narcissist crosses that one particular line that can never be uncrossed again, something inside the super empath genuinely shifts. It is not rage that rises up in them, and it is not bitterness or some hunger for revenge either. What surfaces instead is a calm so precise it feels almost surgical. A realization forms, quiet but absolute, that the person they had been trying so hard to heal was never actually interested in growing, was never capable of any real give and take, was never willing to match the devotion that had been given to them so freely. This clarity arrives like a spotlight suddenly switched on, illuminating every red flag they had previously explained away, every inconsistency they had once made excuses for, every manipulation they had quietly tolerated without ever pushing back. In that moment, the entire illusion collapses at once. The empath's mind begins replaying old memories, not through an emotional lens this time, but with a kind of cold accuracy, almost as though they are studying a pattern from the outside now instead of being trapped somewhere inside it. They start to see clearly how the narcissist manufactured false promises, engineered conflict on purpose, and built entire cycles of chaos specifically designed to keep them off balance. They remember every instance where affection was used as a weapon, where silence was deployed as punishment, where validation was dangled like bait. They recognize with painful clarity the exact moments their own intuition had tried to warn them, and how they had pushed that warning aside because they loved so deeply. Now, with the betrayal fully out in the open, that same intuition becomes their strongest guide, pointing them steadily toward the truth. Betrayal can become the turning point that helps an empath see a narcissist's manipulative patterns with new clarity. As the empath stops seeking approval, strengthens boundaries, and emotionally disengages, the narcissist may lose a key source of influence. The empath's calm withdrawal shifts the relationship dynamic, making old manipulation tactics far less effective and allowing the empath to reclaim confidence, self-worth, and emotional independence. While people and situations vary, increased clarity and healthy boundaries often reduce the power of manipulative relationship patterns. They may pretend indifference, chase after new sources of supply, or play the victim in front of others, but none of it actually fills the space that has been left behind. What the narcissist misses is never really the empath as a person. What they miss is the control, the predictable reactions, the emotional fuel they had grown so accustomed to taking without a second thought. The empath's withdrawal also quietly demolishes the story the narcissist has always told themselves about who they are. Narcissists build elaborate inner narratives of superiority and invincibility, and those narratives only hold up as long as other people keep complying with them. When the empath stops engaging entirely, that story starts collapsing under its own weight. The narcissist can no longer convince themselves the empath is obsessed, desperate, hopelessly loyal, or emotionally attached in the way they once assumed. The silence forces them to confront a truth they have spent their whole life avoiding, that the empath never actually needed them in the first place. Slowly, they begin to understand that all the drama, all the manipulation, all the carefully staged power plays were nothing but illusions, kept alive purely because the empath kept participating in them. Once that participation ends, the narcissist is left standing in a silence that feels genuinely humiliating to them. They can sense their control slipping away, and the image they had constructed of themselves begins to crack open. This kind of withdrawal represents the empath's strongest form of power, precisely because it requires such deep emotional discipline to maintain. It means choosing peace over chaos, choosing boundaries over self-sacrifice, choosing plain truth over confusion. The empath is not doing this to punish the narcissist. They are simply choosing themselves for once. They redirect all that energy inward, toward healing, toward rebuilding, toward remembering who they were before the narcissist's influence dimmed their light so significantly. This particular kind of withdrawal traps the narcissist in a psychological corner because it denies them the one thing they crave more than anything else: control. Narcissists feed on emotional cycles, and the empath's flat refusal to keep participating destroys the rhythm they had come to rely on so heavily. Their attempts to pull the empath back in grow more desperate by the day. Apologies, sudden gentleness, grand declarations of love. But the empath, fully awake now, sees straight through it, recognizing it instantly as manipulation dressed up in charm. Their withdrawal becomes a kind of shield that protects them from ever falling back into the old patterns that used to drain them so completely. As the distance between them grows, the narcissist's underlying weakness becomes harder to hide. Their emotions grow unstable, their mask cracks more visibly, and they lash out, blame everyone around them, and sink into self-pity, unable to comprehend how they lost control of someone they believed they owned emotionally. They are forced to confront the truth that their power was never real to begin with, borrowed instead from the emotional generosity of the very person they tried to break down. The narcissist's downfall genuinely begins with this withdrawal because nothing threatens them more than becoming irrelevant. Betrayal awakens something powerful inside the super empath, transforming their pain directly into strength. Every empath carries deep resilience somewhere inside them, resilience that often stays quiet until something finally pushes them past their limit. The narcissist, believing themselves emotionally superior, never imagines their own betrayal will be the very thing that awakens this hidden strength. They mistake sensitivity for weakness, without ever realizing that sensitivity is actually a form of awareness, and awareness itself becomes strength once activated. When the illusion finally breaks, something rises up inside the empath, a genuine determination to reclaim themselves, to stop shrinking, to stop endlessly explaining themselves, to stop overgiving to people who give nothing back. Their worth was never tied to how much mistreatment they could tolerate, but to the strength they had been carrying the entire time. The betrayal tears through their emotions and exposes everything they had been quietly ignoring, but instead of collapsing under that weight, the super empath begins to rise. Pain organizes them. It pulls their scattered emotional pieces back into alignment, and they stop treating the betrayal as personal failure, recognizing it instead as proof of the narcissist's true nature. As this strength continues rising, the empath finally understands patterns they had previously misread entirely. They see clearly now how flattery was used to create dependence, how silence was used to instill fear, how manufactured chaos was used to control outcomes. They see how their kindness was exploited, how their love was twisted into something unrecognizable, how their forgiveness was wielded like a weapon against them. This new understanding does not weaken them at all. It empowers them completely. For the first time in a long while, they step fully out of the emotional fog and into clear, undeniable truth. They no longer feel any compulsion to rescue, to explain, or to sacrifice themselves for someone who never valued that sacrifice. Betrayal becomes the final lesson that carries them into real, lasting power. The empath's transformation genuinely unsettles the narcissist because it happens quietly on the inside and proves completely unstoppable once it takes root. The narcissist can play games with emotions, but they simply cannot control genuine awareness. Once awareness fully arrives, whatever spell had been holding the empath in place breaks entirely. There is no argument, no charm, no guilt trip capable of pulling them back into the old dynamic anymore. The empath grows stronger, not through fighting back, but through detaching completely. They focus their energy on healing, on growth, on finding new direction. They return to passions they had long since abandoned, rebuild relationships they had neglected along the way, and realign themselves with values they had quietly compromised. Every single day spent apart becomes an investment in themselves. Their strength is not fueled by hatred toward the narcissist, but by genuine understanding of what actually happened. They come to realize the narcissist's betrayal was truly never about them personally at all. It was always about the narcissist's own character. That realization becomes a kind of shield. The empath becomes grounded, calm, and composed in a way they had not been in a long time. Their reactions become measured. Their emotions become balanced. Their perspective sharpens considerably. A genuine calm forms that the narcissist simply cannot break through, a calm that reflects real emotional mastery. As the empath continues growing stronger, the narcissist loses control of the story they had been telling. They can no longer label the empath as fragile, confused, or dependent, because none of that holds up anymore. The empath's strength forces the narcissist to confront limits they have avoided facing their entire life. The shift in power becomes undeniable. The narcissist grows increasingly unstable because they cannot understand how the empath has become so completely immune to them. They try to provoke old reactions and get only neutrality in return. They try guilt, and it gets recognized instantly for exactly what it is. They try love bombing, and it simply feels hollow and empty now. What looks like devastating betrayal from the narcissist's perspective is, in reality, genuine freedom for the empath. Pain becomes the teacher, and growth becomes the victory. Betrayal becomes the beginning of a stronger identity, one that no longer requires approval or validation from anyone else. The empath becomes emotionally self-sufficient, drawing their power instead from awareness, wisdom, and lived experience. Their boundaries become firm, their intuition sharpens, their self-respect becomes entirely non-negotiable. They rise from the betrayal, not as someone broken, but as someone genuinely transformed, carrying a quiet strength that simply cannot be shaken anymore. This represents a turning point the narcissist has no way of undoing. The empath's strength shines in ways the narcissist can never copy or control. The empath becomes more emotionally intelligent, more self-aware, more firmly anchored in truth than ever before. Their clarity exposes the narcissist's darkness. Their strength blocks any further manipulation. Their very presence proves the existence of something the narcissist could never manage to destroy. The narcissist watches this transformation unfold, genuinely confused by how the pain they caused somehow became the very source of the empath's power. The empath, now fully awake, sees everything clearly and keeps moving forward, carrying a kind of strength that only comes from surviving deep emotional wounds. When the super empath finally detaches completely, the narcissist loses their supply of admiration for good. The empath's presence had never been merely emotional support, it had functioned as genuine psychological fuel. The narcissist fed constantly on admiration, validation, attention, and the natural emotional warmth the empath provided without even having to think about it. The empath noticed details other people overlooked entirely, offered reassurance without ever needing to be asked, and brought real depth into moments the narcissist could never have created on their own. This emotional richness became central to the narcissist's own sense of importance, and they grew genuinely addicted to it, assuming it would simply always be there for the taking. They came to see the empath as an endless well of praise, loyalty, and care. But that particular well is not limitless at all. It survives only on respect, honesty, and mutual balance. When cruelty or betrayal shatters that foundation, admiration does not just diminish, it disappears entirely. The narcissist mistakes admiration for weakness. They treat care as though it were permission to exploit rather than a genuine gift to be honored. They assume devotion equals ownership. They believe the empath will admire them regardless of how badly they behave because they confuse real empathy with desperation. But detachment shatters that illusion completely. Admiration becomes unreachable, not out of any desire for revenge, but simply because the empath now sees with total clarity. Admiration cannot coexist alongside that kind of clarity. Once the empath fully recognizes the narcissist's true intentions, their patterns, their underlying emptiness, admiration transforms into plain understanding, and that understanding removes whatever spell had once been in place. Detachment is not really a reaction at all. It is a genuine shift in consciousness. The empath stops seeing the narcissist as someone who needs saving and starts seeing them instead as someone who needs to be held accountable. They stop carrying the narcissist's feelings and start protecting their own instead. That inner shift cuts off the flow of admiration entirely. The empath stops idolizing unrealized potential. They stop excusing real harm in the name of hope. They stop mistaking intensity for genuine love. Detachment restores clear logic, strengthens boundaries, and completely changes how they see the narcissist from that point forward. The narcissist feels this shift almost immediately. They notice fewer reactions coming their way, less praise, less emotional access than before, and grow increasingly uneasy because their identity depends on being admired the way the rest of us need oxygen. Without it, their self-image begins slowly collapsing. They try restarting the admiration using old familiar methods, charm, apologies, projecting confidence, but none of it lands the way it once did. The empath's clarity filters all of it out. Losing admiration genuinely crushes the narcissist because it functions as their emotional inheritance, and without it, they feel small, unseen, and unimportant. A deep emptiness rises that cannot be filled by shallow attention or by chasing some new source of supply elsewhere. The empath's admiration had always been different, real, deep, intuitive, genuinely healing, and it made the narcissist feel special in a way external praise could never replicate. When it disappears, it leaves behind a wound they cannot soothe on their own, and every new source of attention feels cheap compared to what they lost. Detachment also means the empath stops feeding into the narcissist's ongoing story altogether. They stop reacting to blame, stop defending themselves against accusations that were never fair, stop entering the emotional loops they used to get pulled into so easily. The narcissist cannot draw power from someone who simply refuses to engage anymore. And with no engagement left to draw from, their emotional dominance disappears completely. They become frantic, cycling rapidly between anger, neediness, arrogance, and self-pity. But the empath stays steady through all of it, their energy simply no longer available to be taken. As detachment continues, the empath begins directing admiration back toward themselves for once, redirecting all the energy they once poured into the narcissist toward their own healing, growth, and self-discovery instead. That redirection makes them even stronger and makes it that much harder for the narcissist to ever find their way back in. The narcissist watches this unfold and feels genuinely irrelevant, knowing somewhere inside that the empath's admiration had been the central pillar holding up the entire dynamic, and without it, everything collapses. The hardest truth for the narcissist to face is that empathy and admiration can never be forced, performed, or faked convincingly. They have to be genuinely earned through integrity, consistency, and real character, qualities the narcissist has never actually possessed. The empath's detachment becomes the final proof that the narcissist was never as powerful as they believed. Their entire influence depended completely on the empath's willingness to invest in them, and when that investment ends, the narcissist is left standing entirely alone, forced to face the version of themselves they had spent a lifetime avoiding. Detachment becomes the exact moment they realize they have lost something they can never get back, and no amount of charm, control, or manipulation is capable of repairing what they destroyed with their own hands. The narcissist's downfall truly begins the instant the super empath stops responding emotionally, because emotional reaction has always been the narcissist's lifeline. They need it for validation, for control, for a sense of importance they have never been able to generate from within themselves. They interpret every emotional response, sadness, anger, confusion, even lingering love, as proof they still hold psychological power over the empath. They depend on the empath's emotional depth to feel significant. They need intense feelings, predictable reactions, and ongoing drama, because those reactions reflect back their fantasy of being in control. When the reactions finally stop coming, a psychological void hits them hard, almost like cutting off the power source that had been keeping their ego alive all along. The empath's stillness is not some performance. It is a genuine transformation. They detach internally first before anything else changes on the outside. They stop letting the narcissist's moods and words shape their own inner world. The shift happens quietly, but it is massive in scope. They observe now instead of absorbing everything. They notice patterns instead of taking on responsibility that was never theirs. They recognize manipulation clearly instead of dismissing it as simple misunderstanding. Old triggers stop working entirely, and without any reaction, whatever control the narcissist once held simply disappears. The empath's silence becomes the one truth the narcissist cannot escape, and it forces them to confront their own insignificance head-on. The narcissist cannot tolerate emotional neutrality because it exposes exactly how hollow their influence actually was all along. In the past, reactions had made them feel powerful. Now, silence reveals the real truth. Their power was always borrowed, only ever existing because the empath chose to participate. That realization creates panic, anger, and desperation in them. They escalate, becoming louder, harsher, sweeter, sadder, cycling through every strategy they know, but every failure only increases their panic further. Their self-image shatters. They feel invisible, unimportant, and increasingly irrelevant. The empath's withdrawal becomes a mirror reflecting back the exact emptiness they had spent their whole life trying to escape. Words lose their power. Gestures lose their meaning. Presence loses its weight entirely. The empath's steady calm becomes a shield the narcissist has no tools to break through, because their whole strategy has always depended on open emotional access. And when that access closes for good, they become powerless. As the empath stops responding, they begin genuinely finding themselves again. The space once filled with worry and confusion transforms into space for real self-reflection. They reconnect with their values, their strength, their intuition, and that grounding makes them even less reactive over time. Their emotions steady, their thoughts clarify, and healing begins from the inside out, which weakens the narcissist's influence even further. A healed empath simply cannot be controlled by a wounded narcissist anymore. The narcissist tries switching between masks, remorseful one moment, indifferent the next, furious after that, but none of it works, because the empath no longer believes in emotional performances of any kind. The narcissist realizes confusion no longer works on this person, and confusion had always been one of their primary weapons. Without it, manipulation fails entirely, and this new immunity marks the beginning of the narcissist's collapse. Silence also destroys whatever sense of superiority the narcissist once held. When the empath stops reacting, the narcissist begins doubting their own charm, their own power, their own identity. Insecurity grows steadily because silence feels like rejection to them, and rejection is the one thing they have never learned how to handle. As the distance grows, they unravel further, becoming impulsive and unstable. They try punishment, but it fails because the empath no longer fears abandonment. They try jealousy, but it fails because the empath no longer needs their approval. They try love bombing, but it feels transparently fake. Every method loses its power. They come to realize they are powerless, not because the empath has turned cruel, but simply because the empath is finally awake. Emotional neutrality becomes a form of independence, signaling that emotional sovereignty has fully returned to its rightful owner. And that loss of influence is the narcissist's greatest defeat of all. They cannot force love, respect, or admiration out of someone who sees the whole truth so clearly. When the narcissist finally realizes that the very person they underestimated and once tried to shrink down has instead stepped into real emotional strength, a quiet panic begins rising inside them because it destroys the reality they had built specifically to maintain control over that person. They sense that the bond they had relied on, the access they had grown so used to enjoying, the validation they had been quietly taking for granted, are simply no longer available to them anymore. That loss shakes them far more deeply than they will ever admit out loud, because their ego depends entirely on believing they are unforgettable, irreplaceable, always central to the lives of anyone they have ever dominated. When you reclaim your own worth and detach fully from their influence, the illusion of control they had built collapses completely, forcing them to face a truth they have spent their entire life running from: that the power they believed they had was never real strength at all. It was deception, manipulation, and the vulnerability of the very people they targeted along the way. This reversal disturbs them on a genuinely deep level because they cannot tolerate the fact that someone they mistreated has become emotionally untouchable, independent, and self-assured in ways that expose exactly how empty their own identity really is. They will search for ways to re-enter your life, not because they have actually changed, but because your resilience threatens the very foundation their self-image rests upon. Their greatest fear has always been losing relevance in a life they once controlled so effortlessly. Your transformation becomes a mirror reflecting their insecurities, their weakness, their inability to genuinely connect with another human being, and that reflection is precisely what they have avoided facing their entire existence. As you continue rising emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, they feel increasingly exposed because their old tactics no longer work on you. Your distance becomes a form of accountability they never expected to face. They may try baiting you, provoking you, attempting to pull you back in, but every failed attempt only reminds them further that you have outgrown the entire cycle. And that truth hurts far more than any argument ever could, because it proves their influence was never permanent to begin with. As your own energy continues to shift, they feel the empty space where your empathy and effort used to be. That void becomes impossible for them to ignore, because it reveals exactly how dependent they truly were on the emotional support you gave them so freely. Without you, they cannot recreate that emotional nourishment because their other connections tend to run shallow rather than genuinely real. Their reaction becomes some mixture of fear, envy, regret, and desperation, though they will likely never admit to any of it openly, since that would require a level of self-awareness they have spent their whole life avoiding. So instead, they watch from a distance, pretending everything is fine, while secretly grappling with the reality that they pushed away the one person who genuinely cared and saw real value in them even when they did not deserve it. Your confidence exposes their instability. Your clarity exposes their chaos. Your self-love exposes the hollowness hiding behind the persona they hide behind. As you keep evolving, they are left living with a loss they can never reverse. Not the loss of you as a person exactly, but the loss of the emotional power they once held through you. Your growth becomes a kind of karma they never saw coming, because it asks nothing at all from you in return, only the quiet, steady expansion of your own strength, which reminds them of everything they once tried to bury inside you. Their fear only grows as they realize you have become someone they can no longer control, influence, or diminish in any way. And that realization becomes the true turning point where the balance of power shifts completely and permanently to you, leaving them behind to face an emptiness that no new source of supply will ever be able to fill.